Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. As some of you may know, my name is Dr. Marumo. After the unbanning of the African National Congress and the release of Nelson Mandela in 1990, South Africa's interim constitution was negotiated to establish the framework for the country's first democratic elections. The ANC's members in exile were granted indemnity so they could enter the country to participate in negotiations. They established a basis upon which, for the first time in history, perpetrator and victim of the apartheid regime could confront each other, not in conflict, but to negotiate a common future. Their alternative was mutual annihilation, the absence of a future for both. Constructing a future meant that they had no choice but to confront the country's past. In the year following the 1994 elections, Parliament drafted the Promotion of National Unity and Reconciliation Act, which established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The 17-member commission was tasked with establishing a complete picture as possible of the causes, the nature, and extent of human rights violations in regard to the period between 1 March 1960 and the cutoff date. The TRC would conduct investigations and hold hearings. It also had to facilitate the granting of amnesty to persons who came forward and made full disclosure of all the relevant facts relating to acts associated with a political objective. In addition, the Truth and Reconciliation was required to restore the human and civil dignity of victims and recommend reparation measures, and to compile a report of findings and activities and provide recommendations to prevent future violations of human rights. But in the process of appointing the 17-member commission, the head of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the great Nobel Peace Prize laureate, the Archbishop Desmond Tutu, was asked a question. What kind of people would serve as commissioners? The Archbishop responded, "We are looking for people who were victims to serve as commissioners. The most forgiving people I have come to know are people who themselves have suffered. It is as if suffering has ripped them open into empathy. I am talking about wounded healers," said the Archbishop. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great honor today, on behalf of the University of Notre Dame Law School, to welcome back our distinguished global jurist in residence, Justice Dumisa Ntsebeza, who prior to appointment as a Justice of the African Court of Human and People's Rights was appointed by President Nelson Mandela to serve the people of South Africa on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission as the head of its investigative unit. Allow me, Justice Ntsebeza, to discard with this neutral term of commissioner. For the term commissioner does not tell us about the quality of person who carried the weight of a wounded nation. Archbishop Desmond Tutu tells us that only a wounded healer, a person who has suffered, who has gone into the darkness of the human heart, and was able to find in themselves empathy and forgiveness could be a wounded healer. How do we forgive those who trespass against us? The prayer asks. The age-old isiXhosa hymn, Lizalise idinga lakho, which opened the first sitting of the Truth and Reconciliation in April 1996 in the Eastern Cape, tells us that forgiveness of sins makes a person whole. How do you, one who has endured the might of the apartheid regime in such inexplicable terms, one who has been branded a terrorist, forcibly removed from his loved ones, arrested, imprisoned, and detained without trial, placed in a death cell, under solitary confinement, on death row indefinitely? How do you refuse to be subjugated and allow your soul to be removed from your humanity? How do you go on to heal others? That is the question today. You survived. You are here today, Justice Ntsebeza, and you have shared with me the intimate story of your time in solitary confinement, your survival mechanism, and the psychological scarring that it has left on you, how decades later, you still find and catch yourself speaking to yourself, even at times in the company of people, as though to remind yourself that you are still alive and sane. I find myself likening you to the American poet Lawrence Paul Dunbar's Caged Bird in his poem To Sympathy. For you know how the caged bird sings. You know how the caged bird beats his wing till its blood is red on the cruel bars. For in hope he must fly back, perch and cling himself, still with the pain that throbs in the old scars and pulses with a keener sting. You, Justice Ntsebeza, know why the caged bird sings. When his wing is bruised and his bosom is sore, when he beats his bars, he would be free. You know why the caged bird sings and is undying for his freedom. Over the 2 years of the TRC, we were exposed to daily traumatic revelations in South Africa that assailed our national psyche. In the cities, in the small towns, in improvised courtrooms fashioned out of town halls, community centers, and churches, the horrific drama of apartheid and the anti-apartheid movement played itself almost cinematically and assailed our public consciousness. Our eyes reddened and flowing with tearful rivers. We were glued to our television screens and our ears attentively hanging on every word that came out of the radio. Harrowing accounts of human atrocity as we became pathologically accustomed to mixing our breakfast, lunch, and dinner with stories of blood. Death had a smell and an acquired taste. The ground upon which we walked and sat and slept was scarred with terror, a vast terrain of unmarked, unquiet graves. How do we lay these ghosts to rest was the question. But somehow, Justice Ntsebeza, ladies and gentlemen, we survived. The great South African poet, political activist, former apartheid prisoner on Robben Island, journalist Dennis Brutus reassures us. He says, somehow we survive, and tenderness frustrated does not wither. Investigating searchlights rake the contours of our naked, unprotected contours over our heads. The monolithic decalogue of fascist prohibition glowers and teeters for the catastrophic fall. Boots club the peeling doors, but somehow we survive. Somehow we survive severance. We survive deprivation and we survive loss. Patrols uncoil along the asphalt dark, hissing their menace to our lives. Most cruel, our land is scarred with terror, rendered unlovely and yet lovable. Sundered we are, and all our passionate surrender, and somehow tenderness survives. Ladies and gentlemen, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is a sharply focused microcosm of the South African society in transition. We are able to chart the progress of democracy and reconstruction by tracing its troubled, volatile history. An in-depth retrospective analysis of its work enables us to understand the human cost of the transition. But your work, Justice Ntsebeza, offers the world more to be reflected upon today, especially today in this calamitous era of international war. I dare say it offers us more to think about, as the world is more prone to meeting violence with more violence today. It offers us more because it has allowed us to hear the voices of those who are often removed from the public discourse about peace. Through personal recollections of those who testified before the TRC and told the grotesque traumas and scars for all to see and hear. But this was not out of victimhood, but it was out of hope for survival. In so doing, the lives of these human beings tell us today, when we reflect on the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that we must put real flesh to rhetorical terms like a just war or crimes against humanity, because we are the sons and daughters of survivors. We are the nephews and nieces of those who never came home. We who have our trauma unburied with every bone uncovered. Where do we fit in this truth? We remember the plea of the widow of the disappeared Pindile Mfeti, who asked simply, Justice Ntsebeza, for something to bury, a piece of bone or a handful of ash of her disappeared husband. How did our ancient languages bend, twist, and break under the pressure of forced description, under the pressure of atrocity to forcibly describe the indescribable? How does language account for the question, how did they barbecue my child? Testimony after testimony, survivors seized language by its bare, soft skull, robbing it of its innocence to human cruelty. In their tearful testimonies, they whispered tenderly to their loved ones, as if to say, beloved, do not die. Do not dare die, for I, the survivor, I wrap you in words so that the future may inherit you. I snatch you from the death of forgetfulness. I tell your story so I may complete your ending. As we evaluate the unfinished business of South Africa's apartheid past, we ask the question today, Justice Ntsebeza, has the Truth and Reconciliation Commission been successful as an agent of truth, reconciliation, and reparation? The question is relevant today and indeed compelling in recent times, as it was on July 25, 1996, when the Constitutional Court of the Republic of South Africa had to decide a challenge to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the Azanian People's Organization versus President of the Republic of South Africa. Decades later, While grappling with the transgenerational trauma, we are discovering that the relationship between truth and reconciliation is far more complex than we ever imagined it to be. But President Mandela speaks through the ages. He tells us that the complexity should be resolved by us realizing that in the end, reconciliation is a spiritual process which requires more than just a legal framework. It must happen in the hearts and minds of people. How does one carry the weight of a wounded nation? It is your human experience, Justice Ntsebeza, that has summoned our gathering here this afternoon. How did you survive? We ask you to tell us, please, today, wounded healer. Share with us your story of survival. Ladies and gentlemen, I welcome Justice Dumisa Ntsebeza.
Good day. Oh, let me repeat. Good day, everybody.
Good day.
Oh, yeah. Then I am in the presence of the living. I thought that I am in the presence of the dead. Thank you, Sadi, for those accolades which you have heaped upon me. And it always reminds me, and I probably said this the last time I was addressing this august body, the last time I was here. It always reminds me of what the Archbishop, the late Archbishop Emeritus Tutu, who was the chairman of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, used to say, because he was a man who was always full of jokes. He would tell a story of how a widow attended with her daughter the funeral of a late husband. And as accolade upon accolade was heaped upon the deceased, the widow became restless. And at some stage, she decided she could not sit there anymore. And she whispered to her daughter, I think we've come to the wrong funeral. And off they went. So when I listened to you, Professor Marumu, saying all those beautiful things, and I said, what am I going to talk about? He has done all the speech that I was going to give. And I was quite happy that mine was going to be simply a narrative of that day when I was pointed out at a hearing as a perpetrator, or as a person who had been driving a motor vehicle by a simple person whom you see on your screens, who portrayed himself and whom the media portrayed as a simple gardener, as a simple person from whom throughout the hearings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or from people of a similar ilk, we had heard and had sympathized and had assumed that nothing but the truth would emanate from the likes of this Wakadna, Mr. Sibaya, who testified or was called to come and testify about a fateful day in the history of our country, where people had been killed in cold blood. And that killing was associated with a group of people from the Pan-Africanist Congress of Tanzania. These three young men were called foot soldiers of the Tanzanian People's Liberation Army. And they had attacked a tavern. That much was common cause. And this tavern was at a place called Heidelberg. That much was common cause. Why was it common cause on this day of this hearing? It was common cause because they were applying for amnesty. They were before the Truth Commission because the three of them had been arrested before, tried, convicted, and were now serving long terms of imprisonment for what they had done at this tavern in Heidelberg. So it was not an issue as to what they had done, nor was it an issue whether what they had done was a gross violation of human rights. And as I've said in some of the lectures here, the Act defined what constitutes a gross violation of human rights. And I've told some of you whom I've lectured so far that the Act defined a gross violation of human rights as a killing, an abduction, torture, and severe treatment. So what these young men, these three young men from the Tanzanian People's Liberation Army had done, fell squarely within those acts, or omissions, but acts in this case, in relation to whom they were entitled to apply for amnesty. And they did apply for amnesty. And therefore, when they were in this hearing, it was after they had been sentenced to long periods of imprisonment. And they took advantage of the availability of amnesty in terms of the promotion of National Unity and Reconciliation Act for purposes of applying to be released from prison that they were in, and to be absolved from criminal liability and civil liability, because the Promotion of National Unity Act sanctioned anyone to be granted amnesty in the circumstances in which they were. So that is the background to what I elected to talk about today. Because you see, what I will talk about is an event that almost derailed the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. On the day it happened, I was sitting in the amnesty hearing. And I think Mr. Sibaya, the gentleman you see in the picture, was testifying. And his testimony was supposed to be about what he knows happened on that fateful day when the victims of the attack by the 3 young men from the Azanian People's Liberation Army took place. How did this affect me? That is going to be the topic for our discussion. It starts from the day when a captain from the South African police was seconded to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Those of you I have spoken to, I think yesterday, for instance, I indicated that in my investigative unit, there were 3 sources. There was a third of my investigative unit which came from trained police people who invariably had been police officers in the apartheid order. It was important because we needed people who had been trained police officers who would be able to conduct investigations in the manner in which such investigations should be conducted with expertise. A third of that investigative unit was drawn from overseas-based police officers, mostly from Scandinavian countries. And the theory was that we needed people who are trained, who would be able to come and investigate 34 years of South African history without fear, favor, or prejudice, because they would be able to investigate violations of human rights committed on either side of the political divide. So was the thinking. These are people who would not come and investigate on the Apartheid-Era security personnel, who would investigate every violation, gross violation of human rights as I've defined, precisely because they would focus only on whether there were able to find in their investigations the violations that I've described that fell within the definition of what a gross violation of human rights was. So a third of my investigative unit comprised of those people who were drawn from the international community. Of course, then the third was drawn from NGOs, people who have been investigators, journalists in particular, people who had the skill to find the truth, because that was their profession. So as things are then, there is this gentleman called John Lubbe, L-U-B-B-E, was a captain seconded from the South African police or post-apartheid, or during the new era, post-apartheid era, we had begun to call them the South African Police Service. John Lubbe, a captain seconded from the SAPS, South African Police Service, one day on the 10th of May, 1997, gets into my office. I'm a commissioner on the 6th floor. And he carries with him what in Afrikaans is called an inligtingsnota, an information note. He says, this information note is something I found in a file when I was busy investigating the case of 3 young men who have applied for amnesty for the killings at the Heidelberg Tavern. And I said, yes. He says, you see, in this file, I have discovered that there was a getaway car, according to the statements that we have, which had the numbers XA 12848. XA 12848 is the getaway car from the scene. And that getaway car, on my investigation, happens to be a vehicle that belongs to you. I am therefore bringing to your attention that there is something that you need to answer. There is a question, or there is a need for an answer as to how you become associated in the manner I'm describing with this motor vehicle. And it becomes more interesting Hence, people will say truth is stranger than fiction. Because Captain Lube tells me that this file describes an event that took place on the 30th of December 1993, and that in January of 1994, that is the time that this information note became part of the docket. The dilemma, of course, was the fact that in that period of time, I was in Cape Town. I had driven from the Eastern Cape, where my home was at the time. And as these events took place, I was in Cape Town. The question was whether I was able to explain away why there was an information note that had the number plates of my vehicle. This information note had been endorsed by one General Snyman, who, when I saw his name, I remembered had made another allegation in another information note about a similar event, except that that event had taken place in the part of the Eastern Cape where I was practicing. In that instant as well, General Snyman, in an attack on a place called Northcrest, had identified my home as a training place for activists of the Azanian People's Liberation Army. And therefore it tied, and I remember that I had reported this allegation, or I had received this information about General Snyman associating my home as a training ground for the Azanian People's Liberation Army from General Dumisa, who was the military leader of that part of the Eastern Cape called Sky. And again, because I would like you to remember these, because they are dots to be connected. The same General Snyman says, training grounds for Azanian People's Liberation Army, the home of Dumisa Ntsebeza in Tata. In Cape Town, as I've indicated, Dumisa Ntsebeza's car with number plates XA 12848 is associated with a tavern attack in Heidelberg. And on the face of it, it makes sense. Because when you connect these dots, you have to come to the conclusion that this person has something to do with these gross violations of human rights by these terrorist units of the Azanian People's Liberation Army. Of course, why does it surface only in 1997 when that note is brought to me? That was the key question. And that is the question I asked. If the police have known all this time that there was an association that has to be made with the Azanian People's Liberation Army activists and me, why is it that up to this point, up to this day, in 1997, it is only now that it is surfacing? It is surfacing when it was public knowledge that I was going to be appointed, and I got appointed by President Mandela as a commissioner in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It became public knowledge that I was not only a commissioner, but I was going to be in charge of the investigative unit. And it had gone, I mean, my appointment had gone for up to the date I indicated, 1997. And only at an amnesty hearing do I get this person who is allegedly an ordinary poor gardener. 10th of May, 1997, only then does Lube bring this thing to me. And of course, when I was pointed out at this hearing, all hell broke loose. And what you see on your screen is what caused the wheels. What was actually conceived to be a perfect linkage between me and the killings, the wheels started to fall off. Because quiet investigation by media people, beyond the sensation of being pointed out as one of those who was involved in the attack on the tavern, quiet investigation led to that man, Asim Ashe, that man you see on your screen, who wrote the article. Because he is the one who then began to connect the dots. And he says, you say this guy is a gardener, an ordinary gardener? I know him. I know him because he is not just a gardener. This person is an internationalist. I personally saw him. I met him in Ghana. So much for him being a Ghanaian. And when I met him, he was clearly not somebody who was just an ordinary gardener. He was there in furtherance of whatever it was. Certainly, he is not the kind of gardener that people have associated him with. And he said, further, far from him just being an ordinary gardener, this is a man who owns property. And there were other reports that said, that man, in fact, one of the, real estate people said, no, this guy is not just an ordinary gardener, whatever else he may be. He clearly is a person of means. He has bought in an urban area property, and in fact, some of that property, and he has indicated that he is going to get, he's going to be paying for other property. And that is what the journalists began to interrogate. And one of the journalists was Ace. And it is then that Sibaya began. His story began to unravel. And it is then that the interest in him began to cause people to investigate to what extent this was part of the plot to derail the investigative commission. Because the thinking was that if you delegitimize the head or the commission and the head of the investigative unit, then you have literally destroyed the legitimacy of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Because an ordinary gardener will have exposed that the commissioner who's in charge of the investigative unit is himself involved in some of the atrocities which are supposed to be investigated by his unit. And even though the public spectacle of me having been pointed out by Mr. Sibaya, the so-called gardener, had initially shocked the people in our country, but patient journalism, especially by people like Ace Mpashe, and another expose in which I was interviewed by a journalist, Pippa Green, in which I explained to her what was happening during the time that there was supposed to be this massacre, and how I had nothing to do with the attack in Heidelberg. And now, in fact, it was now clear to me that I was a victim of being framed by the state security forces of the apartheid order. As I said, the dots began to unravel the story. Because it was insignificant things like exposing Sibaya not to be the ordinary gardener that everybody had thought he was, but that he was actually an agent. When Richard Goldstone was subsequently appointed to head an inquiry into whether these allegations were true, and when it became clear to the commission that there was something to be followed when these kinds of revelations were made in the media, Sibaya came and made a confession. He sent messages to the Archbishop where he said he wanted to come forward and state the truth. And for him, the truth was that he had been, according to him, he had been arrested by police people who he claimed tortured him and caused him to make the false statement which had been given or had been shown to me by Captain Luba. He said when he was approached by these police people, they had photographs from all angles of every day that I was in Cape Town that January of 1994. And that is why he was then in a position to manufacture the story that I had been in Cape Town, which I was, and yet he knew that I had not been involved. He was the one then to say, this evidence, such as it was brought to me and I was asked to recite it. And he has never been able to understand what it was that they wanted from me, except that apparently he had been an informer for the police and he had been doing that on orders of those who sought to implicate me in the wrongdoing that characterized the attack on the tavern. The bigger question, of course, is why? Why did the police find it was necessary to derail this? Of course, whenever I think of what happened, I think of tradition or a history training anti-apartheid activists by the South African apartheid security systems. Those of you who know of now the UK member of the House of Lords, Lord Peter Hay, will remember, or if you don't, you were young enough not to remember Peter Hay. He was an anti-apartheid activist. Even though he was born in Kenya, he was raised in the UK. And he went on to become the chairman of the Stop the 70s pool, whose aim was to boycott apartheid sport. In 1972, in 1975, Lord Peter Hay, who was still an anti-apartheid activist at the time, was falsely accused and tried in the UK of bank theft on charges that were framed, where he was framed for robbing a bank in the UK. And the South African security services that were called at the time, both Bureau of State Security, had been responsible for framing him. But the rigor with which he was defended resulted in him being acquitted. Truth is stranger than fiction. I always think of what could easily have happened to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission if the machinations of Mr. Sibaya, the innocent gardener who turned out to be an international spy, had borne fruit of the nature that he wanted them to be at the behest of the state security agents, at the behest of General Snyman, who for one reason or another wanted me out of the system, if not by being associated with a massacre, but certainly of the TRC's findings and outcome of their negotiations, of their investigations being discredited. The one person in all of this who will find if you read the book where I give the details of this sordid story. This is the book, Unfinished Business. And I think there are copies of this book. The last 2 chapters are dedicated to explaining the finest details of this. The one thing that I took away from this experience was the fact that when it was all over, the mass media, I got a telephone call from President Mandela, who was traveling from the UK and who would not wait until he had arrived. You will recall that there had been an incident that involved Libya, and Mandela had come to the UK to intervene on behalf of Gaddafi. But even as he was traveling, when he saw that I protested my innocence after having been pointed out in that amnesty hearing by the so-called Gadda, he said, he phoned me and he told me that he had seen on television that I was denying having been involved in the manner alleged. And Mandela said to me, I am glad that you have done so. They can go to hell. And indeed, I also said, they can go to hell. And evidence has since exonerated me. Because Richard Goldstone was given the task thereafter to go deep into what actually happened, especially when Sibaya called the head of my investigative unit and told him that he wanted to be taken to the Truth and Reconciliation special hearing, which had been called after I had been pointed out. And at that special hearing, the gardener, so-called, came and told all the commissioners that he had falsely implicated me at the behest of the apartheid security orders. I was vindicated. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Justice Ntsebeza, for that very, very informative discussion. Without any further ado, I want to open the floor for questions. I understand from Monica that we have until 2 o'clock, so we can take a few questions. If there are any from our audience.
We don't have to ask questions.
We'll start with the lady there, in the back.
Do you feel like this case had an effect on the perceptions of legitimacy for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission at that point? Like, were there any further ramifications for the public perception, or was it pretty quickly resolved after his smuggler international connections were revealed?
Well, I think the the reactions to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission have varied. And I even think that even if there had not been this incident, there would have been as many views about it as there are people. And as I have said in some of the lectures that I've been given, you must think of the mandate that was given to the TRC. The mandate was to investigate gross violations of human rights and other acts or even omissions of a period between 1960 and 1994. That's 34 years. And you know, as Professor Kadi indicated in his intro, the aim was to investigate as much as possible, as to come with an outcome that would give an indication of what happened between 1960 and 1994. Now, that's a wide period. So the TRC, we could only do a broad brush against the canvas, just highlighting those kinds of events that were indicative of what our mandate was. And therefore, the assessment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and its impact is still going to depend on what it is that we are looking at. Could we have done with more time? I don't know. I mean, 34 years is 34 years. Was it enough for us to do it in 18 months' time and add the 6 months that we were entitled to? There are ways in which sometimes we think we did more than we could have done, given the constraints. That is why even today, the subject of the TRC is very much one that is still a subject of debate. I've been given a brief to look, for instance, at and evaluate and review the work of the national prosecuting authorities. Given that at the end of it, there were recommendations we made, and it appears that since 1998, when we handed our first report to the president, and in spite of recommendations that we had made about prosecutions, because the suspension of prosecutions was for that window period where people who were supposed to apply for amnesty should have applied for amnesty, or where people who applied for amnesty and didn't make a disclosure and were denied amnesty would then be subject to prosecution. And the question that I've been briefed to look by way of review is, what what happened to these prosecutions, if there have been any, which the TRC had recommended? And if it is so that there were no prosecutions, notwithstanding the recommendations of the TRC, what is the remedial action for that dereliction of duty on the part of the prosecuting authorities? So it's in an open question.
There is one question from the gentleman in the back.
Yes, forgive me if I didn't catch it, but was there ever a clear motive for why they framed you? And if not, what do you think it would be?
Come again?
Is there a clear motive for why they framed you as such, or why they did that to you?
Oh, well, I know Smaya has not assisted us because, but when there was this commission, the investigation by Goldstone, it appeared that clearly one of the aims was to derail the TRC and actually delegitimize the legacy of the TRC. What can you expect from that thing when all the time, the person who was actually the head of the investigative unit was involved in massacres? I mean, this whole thing is discredited. So that probably is part of the reason why there was this attempt to discredit it. I can think of no other. And of course, a far broader aim was to get at me personally, because up to that point and throughout my legal career, my practice, virtually since I came out of jail and qualified as an attorney, my work has been in the violations of human rights, and I was not very much of a friend of, especially the security forces, the security police in particular, because we would trash in trials, and in most of the cases in which I was involved, one had to do what a man had to do when you had a security policeman testifying. And you would have to tear the witness apart. I don't want to talk about many of the things, but in the course of the period in which I was an attorney and when and there was change, there are no less than 3 attempts that were discovered to have been aimed at eliminating me. It's a very uncomforting thought, but it was either that or I stay away from following my conscience as to where my skills must be directed in the ending of the apartheid order.
Ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, due to time, we can only take one more question. I saw the lady's hand first, so I will allow her to answer that question.
Thank you.
Nanda. And I've been part of the conversations to do with the construction in Uganda, and we've had a chance to look at what you did and what was also done in Nanda. But one of the thoughts that came out, or the other school of thought that came out, was that we should focus on building for the future, and there is fear of the victimization. But as the head of the Truth and Reconciliation Center in South Africa, would you recommend it, and would you do it again, according to what you saw, according to what you have, according to the mere respect we have to give to our people? Would you do it again?
Ironically, you know, in one of my writings, I say Uganda was the first country in Africa to have some form of truth commission. And you see, put it this way. When I was appointed by Kofi Annan as one of 5 commissioners to go and investigate reports of violations of human rights, international human rights, international humanitarian rights in Darfur, and make recommendations, establish whether genocide has been committed, etc., etc. One of the tasks, as you say, was to determine what the remedial measures should be. And I remember the chapter that I wrote was where I said, it is clear to me that Truth and Reconciliation Commissions cannot be imposed. It is the people of that particular community or of that country who should desire that of the post-conflict, you know, solutions to their conditions of either oppression or violence. They are the ones who must determine whether the remedy are criminal prosecutions or Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. Because you see, you can't, for instance, say there must be a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in a situation where, or Nuremberg kinds of trials, where there has been no change, especially in the instruments of coercion, where you find that the old order still is in charge of the army, in charge of the police, in charge of the judiciary even, and in charge of the intelligence services. Then there is certainly not going to be any change there. There are hybrid solutions. For instance, in Sierra Leone, the people there decided that some of the violations that had taken place in Sierra Leone during the conflict situation would only be dealt with by way of criminal prosecutions. But some of them, which they characterize as the less, serious indiscretions, those could be dealt with by way of Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So that also became a way in which they dealt with it. In Rwanda, for instance, the genocide had been such that an entire section, literally, of qualified technocrats, prosecutors, magistrates, and lawyers, and whatever, they have just been wiped out. And that is why a way to deal with impunity in relation to those that had committed the genocide was for the new society to find some other ways, because that would have meant everybody must go to jail. And therefore, there were those gacaca courts that were set up where communities took it upon themselves to deal with remedial action as a consequence of the genocide. So there is no, what do they say? There's not one glove fits all kind of solution. It really must depend on the conditions on the ground. That's a lawyer's answer.
Ntsebeza, once again, it is a great honor to have you here. We thank you very much for the wisdom that you have shared with us. Justice Ntsebeza is a library of knowledge. So as he said, his book, Unfinished Business, copies of it in the library for further reading. But Justice Ntsebeza, just a little token of appreciation from the Notre Dame Law School in gratitude for the time that you've taken out of your extremely busy schedule, your time from the African court, your time from practice in Johannesburg, and all the work that you do internationally. We really, really appreciate the time that you have taken to be with us today and to share these important and invaluable experiences that you've had. And I'm sure they have given us a lot to think about, especially in these times where the wisdom of people with the experience that you have is so needed. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
So thank you very much, everyone. And we really appreciate you joining us. And we hope this has been an informative for all of us.
Now you have a book. The Dean wrote a message for you.
Oh, right. Oh man, yeah. Thank the Dean for it.
You have a meeting with him tomorrow.
Oh,
Yes.
okay. All right. All right.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Oh,
I'm
yeah.
gonna go ahead and take this microphone.
Oh, yeah, okay. Oh, yeah, you know, sometimes one forgets.
Right.
You might just leave.
Last thing is just.
Yeah.
Yeah, they want more pictures.
Oh, okay.
Yes, they do.
Oh, okay, okay. All right.
Let me have that.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Like, if we were in the class